Oh, oh wow, this is a weird feeling. Hey everybody, Step Back is 6 years old, and I was thinking I could look at my first video and see how far I've evolved as a creator. That sounds like fun, right?
We've all heard the stories. Was JFK assassinated by the government? Was 9/11 a black ops operation? Is Obama a socialist Kenyan lizard?
Oh, that's bad. Turns out when I was 26, I was not nearly as developed as a creator or a thinker. So yeah, today we're going to talk about conspiracy theories. They're not, as my video tried to imply, exceptionally American. They're part of pretty much every society. I've started trying to remake this video, but as I researched, I saw multiple different takes on conspiracy theories, and I really went down the rabbit hole. Conspiracies are a huge part of modern culture and a huge part of politics. Even looking at the United States today, you've got QAnon, you've got election truthers, you've got 9/11 truthers, and throughout American history, you have multiple series of elaborate conspiracies about pretty much every major event in American history. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Why do conspiracy theories exist? And we're going to find out why they're so dang popular. But first, I'm going to have to escape from Flatland, I guess, and get back to the three-dimensional world. Well, I didn't realize that when you go to the third dimension, there's actually a toll booth between the two, and I'm a little light on the funds. So I'm going to need to, tighten up the funds. So on that note, this video is sponsored by Skillshare. Skillshare, you guys already know, they have supported Step Back for several years now. It's a learning community where millions come together to learn about all sorts of different things. Design, photography, freelancing. I have looked up all sorts of courses and I have learned so many interesting, quirky tasks. I learned how to design jewelry randomly just because I was bored one day. I learned about how to use my 3D printer, all sorts of wacky stuff. But you get a whole lot of information, you learn quite a few things, and it has a pretty solid price. Less than $10 per month. Solid. Great deal. So one of the little hobbies I've been wanting to get into basically since I was a child is learning how to draw things properly. So I decided that I'm, taking any class I can on how to draw characters and things like that. And luckily, Josiah Brooks, the guy who runs Draw with Jazz there on YouTube, has started yet another course, a 28-day drawing challenge course to learn how to draw anatomy. Specifically, it's called the 28-Day Drawing Challenge to learn how to draw anatomy for comics and illustration. And what's interesting about it is that the whole course isn't available all at once, and that every few days it gets updated with new challenges. So over this 28-day period, you can learn how to draw figures and focus on these different individual tasks. But hey, you can be skeptical. It's a video website. Seen a bunch of them. What makes Skillshare the place for me? Well, don't take my word for it because I'm an idiot. So if you want to try Skillshare for yourself, I actually have a cool little link down in the description and in the pinned comment that gets you a free 1-month trial to Skillshare. So you can try for yourself, see if it's for you, and when you see how much value you'll get, I guarantee you're going to want to stick around. So thank you to Skillshare for supporting Step Back and for sponsoring this video. Man, 2 to 3 dimensional toll booths are really expensive. No wonder I stopped going there. Hey everybody, and welcome to Step Back. I've been doing this for 6 years now, so if you subscribe, there's a whole big back catalog to check out, and they gave me a silver play button, which means I must be doing something right. So I guess we should probably start with the ending of most online debates, and that is with the definition of words. A conspiracy theory is a theory about the speculation that some nefarious group of people are working together on some kind of evil plan. Oftentimes, these are political in motivation, and fairly often they are easier explained by simpler answers. We've also done quite a bit of research into why we believe conspiracy theories. Cognitive science has definitely done its fair share of work to figure that out. We, as apes that figure out how to put clothes on, like to find patterns in things because we're always looking for the next predator or food source or whatever. And because our brains like to find the patterns in things, the goo in our skulls blasts us with a hit of that sweet, sweet dopamine anytime we find one, whether it's real or not. I even found a study where people who had higher levels of dopamine in their brain had a higher chance of believing in conspiracy theories. And because we get that hit of the good stuff, whether it's a real or imagined connection, we find them everywhere. There's a mathematical principle called Ramsey theory, where if you put enough items together in an area, you'll be able to find all sorts of connections. The more things you have in one area, the larger amount of connections you'll find. It's exponential. So much so that if you put enough people in a room, it's almost impossible to not find almost more connections than there are atoms in the universe, putting at least some of these people together. So that's like the neuroscience answer, and like if you were watching like a science-y channel, that's essentially all they'd tell you. But it goes a lot more than that. The video that I did drew heavily from a historian by the name of Richard Hofstadter. He's a very big name in American history circles. In the 1960s, he wrote several books, was very productive, and was very impactful on the profession as a whole. The book that I referenced heavily in my first video is called The Paranoid Style in American Politics. And essentially what Hofstadter does in that book is psychopathologize the conspiracy theorist. He essentially chalked up belief in conspiracy theories to some form of paranoia. He also chalked it up to being a product solely of the far right. And there is like some kind of logic to it. I mean, he wrote the book not too long after World War II and the Second Red Scare, in which McCarthyism raised a certain amount of paranoia about secret communists in American government. And at the end of the day, he believed that all of these conspiracy movements came to either an anti-Semitic or anti-Masonic movement. Now, on the surface, this can be compelling. Compelling enough that in 2015, I decided to make that the focus of my video. But it turns out that taking a group of people who believe a certain set of things and then saying that they're all suffering from paranoid delusions is not cool. And really, if you are taking a group of people and studying them, and the conclusion that you make about them is that they all have some kind of psychological illness, unless the group of people you're studying are a group defined by having a psychological illness, that's not great. So in his lack of an explanation, we have to kind of look into Hofstadter's career as a historian to really understand what's the motivation here, what's going on, what's he doing. Now, Richard Hofstadter, surprise, surprise, was a liberal. And over the course of his life, he moved towards a more and more centrist politics. But primarily, Hofstadter was one of what are called the consensus historians. They were a group of American historians that gave their rise in the mid-century during the height of the Cold War. The idea behind them is that they were intentionally trying to move the historical discipline away from a class-based understanding of American history and move towards one which actively and intentionally rejected class pretty much on ideological grounds. So Hofstadter, instead of turning to economics and material conditions to understand why things happen, turned to essentially Freudian analysis, and that's how he came up with the paranoid style. It was an active attempt to reject Marxist interpretations of American history, and also to try and lower the divisions within America by just not acknowledging that they existed, implying that Americans had more in common with each other than they had differences. And you can imagine that if you're an American historian working at a fancy university and you're trying to make these kinds of claims about an America in the mid-20th century, that you are coming from a position of extreme privilege. So yeah, this part of my first video I denounce and reject wholly. Yeah. Bad me. At the end of the day, it's just our brain's heuristics making connections where there aren't any and taking us socially to some dark places. But that isn't the answer that I gave in my first video. Also, Richard Hofstadter kind of sucks. So yeah, there we go. We used science and historiography to answer why people believe in conspiracy theories. They are just misguided because of our Plato head attempt to understand what is or isn't a tiger. Solved. Simple. I have no idea why the timeline of this video is so much longer than this. Oh no. So when you think you've got a subject, battened down, understandable, you're ready to release it, the last thing you should do is read what Michel Foucault has to say on it. So Michel Foucault, the turtleneck prison guy, wrote this whole thing about what conspiracies are from the perspective of a kind of power analysis and the role of the state. And in his writing on it, he came to the conclusion that there are 3 different ways that the state represses alternative narratives about itself. 1, through straight up violent repression. 2nd, by saying that the alternative explanation, the alternative narrative is somehow irrational. And 3rd, to say that that alternative explanation is not only irrational, but unscientific. And in some ways, I can see where Foucault is coming from. Some of the worst things in history have happened because of very sound and written out, rational and scientific explanations. So to kind of build off what Hofstadter was trying to create with the conspiracy theorist, we can't really talk about conspiracies in a realm of power and, economics and all that kind of thing without looking at the creation of the identity of the conspiracy theorist. Because this is important to mention, the conspiracy theorist was not an organic term. It was one that was cultivated and intentionally created to suppress people. In 1967, the CIA sent a message to a bunch of their branch offices to instruct them on how to interact with media and how to talk about the Warren Commission, which was a project to investigate the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
Our ploy should point out, as applicable, that the critics are 1. Wedded to theories adopted before the evidence is in. 2. Politically interested. 3. Financially interested. 4. Hasty and inaccurate in their research. Or 5. Infatuated with their own theories.
The result of these orders was a media blitz, including a very influential letter to the editor for the New York Times, written by an advisor to Lyndon B. Johnson himself. Channeling Hofstadter's interpretation of conspiracy theorists, he outlined in this letter to the editor that they were a priesthood of marginal paranoids. And this media blitz was successful, and from this period on, this is when conspiracy theorist became a pejorative term. And it really has had a suppressive effect. Noam Chomsky has compared being called a conspiracy theorist to a 4-letter word or a tantrum. And studies of academics have shown that there are a lot of questions that academics have not pursued or investigated in any way because they were afraid of being labeled a conspiracy theorist. And very often, the government or people who have a lot of financial or political power will call somebody a conspiracy theorist when they want a particular point of view to go away. I'll just take a more recent example. The lab leak theory for COVID. Earlier on in the pandemic, the American right was trying to push this idea that COVID leaked from a lab in Wuhan, China, and that this was the source of the pandemic. To a lot of liberals who were very invested in the downfall of Donald Trump's government and who wanted to resist explanations that invoked xenophobia against Chinese people, they said that this was a xenophobic conspiracy theory with no merit to it. To investigate the lab leak theory, you were branded as somehow in league with Donald Trump and the far right and trying to push a racist narrative. That is until we started coming around and realizing that that actually might be something worth investigating. And now that the motivations to take down the Trump administration have gone aside for the moment, the re-examination of the lab leak theory is starting to come up again, and that there are some serious questions about the proliferation of COVID in the early days. I'm not saying that I believe it. I'm just saying that there are people who are way smarter than I am who are investigating it. And I should probably mention, because I did this whole section and I'm realizing that it makes me sound like a little bit of a weirdo, but I want to make a disclaimer to say that I'm not a JFK truther. I'm not a 9/11 truther. And I believe that many of what are called conspiracy theories are not backed up by evidence and simply projections of motivated reasoning. But it is undeniable that the conspiracy theorist label has had a suppressive force that keeps the narrative focused on the people who are in charge, the people who have power. And as a soy boy, rad lib, anarchist, communist, Antifa, that concerns me. Kind of like when people on the left get social justice keywords thrown at them by liberals who are trying to smear them into supporting war criminals and billionaires. I'm just like recalling in my head the Vice article from the 2016 primaries that tried to say that making public health care in America was actually sexist because there are a lot of women who work in the medical insurance industry. And that's certainly a take. So maybe we need a different definition of conspiracy theory than the one that I ripped off Wikipedia at the beginning of this video. I actually found while doing research a wonderful definition for conspiracy theories that explains the problematic aspect of them without simply reinforcing the narratives of the powerful. It has less to do with the substance of the theory itself and more about the type of reasoning that leads to conspiracy theories. Specifically, that they are unfalsifiable, that any evidence to the contrary of the conspiracy is just more confirmation of the scope and size of the conspiracy, and that people who get into these cultures enter a sort of epistemic loop. Probably shouldn't have said epistemic. It's not an accessible word. But you know what I mean. They get stuck in a loop where there's essentially no way for you to be convinced that the conspiracy theory you've bought into is somehow incorrect. And when you find yourself believing in something that there is no amount of evidence that could talk you out of it, there's a problem. And very often these sort of closed off loops are designed to hammer reality into accepting a worldview that you believe in but is at odds with reality. You could also call these types of people reactionaries. Reactionaries, by definition, have a worldview that is at odds with reality. The conspiracy theory allows them to build a mental construct that allows them to force reality through violence to conform to whatever assumptions about the world they want. I suggest that if you're interested in this line of reasoning, that you watch Dan Olson's video In Search of a Flat Earth. In the video, he points out that flat earthers and QAnon people are reactionaries who are desperately trying to force reality to conform to their either biblical literist or fascist worldview. But not all conspiracy theories have to be reactionary. There are plenty that seem more born of an anxiety about particular groups or institutions. They have a set of political beliefs that, if their conspiracy turns out to be true, would confirm many of them. For example, the JFK and 9/11 truther conspiracy theories are rooted in concerns about the deep state. Not like in the QAnon sense, but in the unelected Pentagon officials who just keep and maintain a system of empire. As well, they imply the presence of a large and powerful government that's way more competent than they are in real life. And so it also is an anxiety about government overreach. People who believe in UFO conspiracy theories just so desperately want to believe in a positive answer to the Fermi paradox. The whole thing about why haven't we met aliens? Google it. It's also born of trust issues with the secrecy-obsessed United States, especially in the Cold War era when a lot of new technologies were being tested and nobody would speak up about them because they were secret things to fight the Soviets. You'll also find a lot of conspiracy theories run rampant across the world in unpopular or dictatorial regimes. In many ways, they exist as counter-narratives to confront the official story that represents the government that they're opposed to. And of course, it would be irresponsible to talk about the culture of conspiracy theories without talking about those who have other motivations for amplifying and proliferating them. Because of the stigma against conspiracy theories and the shared values within them, a lot of conspiracies turn into their own like subculture or activist movement, in which case then adherence and belief in the theory becomes part of your membership in a community. And communities can mean a lot to people. And because of that, within the community, the ideas that build up the conspiracy can thrive, multiply, divide, mutate, just like bacteria. It becomes part of people's identity. And when people are tied into an identity based on a belief system that they can't get out of, that can be exploited by people who are not so great actors. Social media platforms base their recommendation engines about trying to maximize the amount of time that viewers spend on their site. One way to do that is to rope them into these conspiracy theories where they can show them an endless cavalcade of affirming content. Not only that, but to get people into even more engagement, once they start poking at the beginning, you can start getting them into more and more radical stuff. This is basically why the alt-right dominated YouTube from about 2014 until whenever YouTube was forced to do something about it. These communities can also be exploited by grifters who use their mistaken beliefs to sell brain pills and mugs and do crowdfunding efforts. We've even seen these conspiracy theories get boosted by state actors in order to sow chaos within different countries. And worst of all, people have used these to gain political power, leading to totalitarianism and genocide. It wouldn't be a Step Back video if I didn't find some way to say genocide. And in our current age, these communities are growing at an unprecedented rate. And it's leading to some real human costs. Just some examples from modern American history. How about the undermining of the electoral process? I don't know if you guys have been checking the news, but election workers for the 2020 election have been receiving death threats. And that's not even talking about the January 6th insurrection, an attempted coup of the American government based out of a conspiracy theory pushed by the loser of the election. And furthermore, QAnon has alienated so many people from their families, it has driven at least one man to murder his own children. And not too long ago, there was a bomb threat in DC by a QAnon believer. You can just check places like the QAnon Casualties subreddit, where you see heartbreaking story after story about people who have lost family members to what is essentially, conspiracy theories sort of fit into this at their extremes, a cult. One of the more tragic recent things is that a victim of the Parkland shooting has had his father become radicalized into QAnon stuff. And now his father is convinced that his own son was a crisis actor at a false flag shooting. So this is awful, obviously, and I believe that you can be a dissident without falling for this kind of stuff. The two things that come to mind right away is that you should probably always be aware of your own thoughts, maybe do a little bit of introspection, and try to see if you hold any unfalsifiable beliefs. And because they're stuck in these belief loops, realize that you can't really use reasoned debate to talk them out of it. No amount of tactical slurs are going to work here. And to go back to Chomsky, because, 9 times out of 10, he's always right, you don't need to see secret plots to think that there is some stuff seriously wrong with the world. You don't need to believe in secret conspiracies to realize that there are places where billionaires meet up to carve up the world's resources and change politics to make sure that they're always in power. Because it's called Davos, and they release their panels free on YouTube. And you can get a lot more mileage understanding why institutions do what they do by looking at them as groups, as institutions. There's something that Chomsky has written about called institutional stupidity, which is a sort of irrational thinking that makes complete sense, but only if you're using the internalized logic of a certain type of institution. So yeah, conspiracy theories are complicated, and there's a lot more to it than just plain dismissal of people who are doing bad think. It's more about how you think than what you think, and in many ways it leads to these pockets, these communities that can be extremely dangerous. So that's a real juxtaposition from the stance I took in my first video. So I've obviously changed a lot between now and 2015. It's been 6 amazing years, And the fact that I went from making horrible images in Google Slides to what I'm doing now with 100,000 of you. Thank you for 6 years, and here's to many more. Oh, just one thing before you go. As a white man, I am required by law to start a podcast, and I am doing so soon. With Scott Nicewander from NerdSync, we are doing a podcast called It's Probably Not Aliens. It's a long-form response to the television show Ancient Aliens, as well as stuff about pseudo-archaeology and pseudo-history and stuff like that. It's going to be premiering on October 5th, so stay tuned. I'll try to put things out on the things so that you know where to find it when it's available. Take care.